LEGO Builder's Journey is a stunning game on PC. A comprehensive ray tracing feature set that includes RT shadows, RTAO, RTGI, and RT reflections gives the game a CG-like quality when running on a high-end computer. Though the game has roots on mobile phones and tablets, the PC conversion makes the most of advanced rendering features to deliver remarkable visuals on appropriate hardware, which makes this new PS5 release rather intriguing. Like the PC, it promises ray-traced visuals, unlike last year's release on Xbox Series consoles. Can the PS5 deliver a top-class experience here? And how does it compare to the conventionally rendered Xbox versions? LEGO Builder's Journey is a rather limited title. It's essentially a series of small puzzle stages, presented from an isometric perspective with limited camera movement. It originally targeted iPhones and iPads after all, with simple and graphically basic levels that wouldn't look particularly exciting on a home console or PC. But this relative visual simplicity, along with the conversion from Unity's more limited universal render pipeline to their advanced high-definition render pipeline, allowed the developer Lightbrick Studio to really scale up the visual quality when it shipped on PC last year. Even without ray tracing features, the title looked excellent, with carefully implemented SSR, ambient occlusion, subsurface scattering, and volumetric lighting. Ray tracing, of course, took the title to the next level, solving all the problems inherent to the screen space techniques and delivering a much more accurate simulation of lighting characteristics. An upgrade like this would likely prove very challenging for a typical high-budget title that was built from the ground up with pre-calculated solutions in mind, but here a ray-traced pathway was eminently feasible and produced great results. So how well do these new console releases compare to the top-end PC version? Let's start with the basics. First up is resolution. All current-gen console versions of LEGO Builder's Journey have a soft and CG-like appearance with minimal aliasing. Edge detail looks quite clean on all platforms here. Texture and within surface detail is where the differences in resolution are most apparent, but even there the differences aren't hugely significant. According to Lightbrick Studio, the game is rendering natively at 2954 by 1662 on Series X and PlayStation 5, and runs at 1970 by 1108 on Series S. No huge surprises there, but again the heavy reliance on post-processing serves to level out some of these differences, and all console versions of the game look subdued, without a lot of fine detail. Conventional pixel counting is rather tough here and tends to turn up inconsistent results, owing to a screen warping perspective correction effect known in computer graphics as the Panini projection that is applied as a post-process. But there is one additional technique that has a massive impact on image quality. The base rendering resolutions are being upscaled to a 4K output using AMD's FSR spatial upscaling technology. For the relatively simple artwork here, FSR actually does a pretty good job at maintaining detail. The Series S release, for instance, has rather similar edge detailing to the higher-end machines, despite rendering internally with less than half the pixel count. FSR often gives somewhat mixed results in other titles, but here it really works well. The combination of lower detail artwork and limited camera movement really shows the technique at its best. Oddly, there is a small strip of flickering colored pixels on the current-gen console releases. In my playthroughs, it appeared on the very top of the image on Series X and PS5, and on the right-hand side of the image on Series S, though on game restarts it would sometimes seem to disappear. This seems like an artifact of the internal render, as the size of the strip becomes larger as the rendering resolution decreases. I'd recommend very slightly overscanning the image while playing to get rid of it. But what about the underlying visual settings? Builder's Journey is an extremely scalable title, and the current-gen console versions actually come in towards the top end of that scale. Let's start with Xbox. The Xbox Series releases lack any RT features, of course, but do look fairly similar to the PC version at max settings without RT features enabled. There are some cutbacks, however. Bloom, volumetrics, motion blur, and depth of field settings are all pegged to the PC's medium options instead of the high option, while ambient occlusion is set to low, and global illumination is curiously set to off. In direct comparisons, the Xbox Series versions hold up pretty well relative to the maxed out, non-ray traced PC release running at the same resolution. So these slight settings modifications don't seem to impact visual quality very much. PS5 packs 2 modes, like most games with ray tracing features on console. The default mode is to leave ray tracing disabled with a 60 FPS framerate target. This mode appears identical to the Xbox Series releases in visual settings. Far more interesting, of course, is the ray tracing mode. Here, the framerate is cut to 30 FPS, while resolution remains at 1662p with FSR upscaling, much like the 60 FPS mode. The non-RT visual settings seem identical to the PS5 in the 60 FPS mode. Ray tracing features are of course promised here. So what are we getting? For reference, the PC version offers 4 toggleable ray tracing settings: shadows, reflections, ambient occlusion, and global illumination. Each offers 3 levels of quality: low, medium, and high. PS5 in RT mode appears to feature implementations of RTAO and reflections here, although the visual results aren't perfectly straightforward. The non-RT implementation of ambient occlusion is quite thick and strong in LEGO Builder's Journey, and the PC's low RTAO setting seems like a good match for what the PS5 RT version is doing here. Just a faint touch of AO around areas where geometry intersects. The higher RTAO settings feature more complex shading than what is present on PS5, but we do still see some gains with a low setting. The tiny gaps between the bricks show proper occlusion, for instance, which is missing from the screen space technique. The situation with the RT reflections is a bit more curious. In general, reflections seem much less present here than in other versions of the game. The PS5 version running in the 60 FPS mode showcases some good-looking specular reflections, as does the PC version with all RT effects enabled. On PS5 in RT mode, however, they appear absent from many surfaces. But there is strong evidence of a ray trace solution being present here. In this area, for instance, we can spot some reflections on the water surface, and on closer examination, they don't have any SSR artifacts when their source is occluded, and they properly remain on screen. In other words, these are real ray traced reflections. However, on PC with RT reflections set to any value, including the low setting, there are far more RT reflections visible than in the PS5's RT mode. The PS5 setting here seems to have less coverage than the PC's low setting, and has less coverage than the PS5 in its 60 FPS mode as well. The general trend here is that reflections on the ground surfaces tend to show up more or less as expected on the PS5 RT mode, while reflections on the sides of the LEGO seem absent. Just look at how the RT mode on PS5 fails to show any reflections here, for instance. It's a curious state of affairs for sure. LEGO pieces themselves are very glossy and reflective on all sides, so this doesn't really make much sense from a materials perspective. However, after I raised this issue with the developer in recent correspondence, they discovered that there's currently a problem with the RT implementation on PS5. While the PS5 is configured to use the low setting for RT reflections, issues with the way the reflections interact with fog, and problems with a specific shader subpass for computing lighting for reflections cause the reflections to essentially disappear on some surfaces. A patch has been prepared that reportedly will be released in the next week or two for the PS5 version that should fix these issues. This screenshot from the post-patch PS5 release that was shared with us does seem to show about the level of reflections coverage that I'd expect. Some of these issues apparently extended to the PC version as well, which was patched shortly after the team confirmed these problems. Thankfully, performance is a much more straightforward proposition on PS5. Both the 60 FPS and RT modes hit their targets perfectly, without even a hint of framerate drops. This is a rather sedate title with little need for twitch reflexes, but even still the consistency is certainly appreciated. Series X powers through here without a hitch, much like PS5, and never wavers from that 60 FPS target. Series S is a bit less stable though, and it does struggle to keep up in some of the denser stages, hitting frame rates in the 50s for extended periods. Most stages do still run at 60 FPS however, just like its more powerful sibling. One last note. I thought I would take a look at the weakest home console version of the game to see just how far back the visuals had to be cut. Lightbrick Studios has two rendering pipelines to pick from here, after all, and I was curious to see if the One S would be downgraded to something more like the mobile feature set. Surprisingly, it's really not too far from the current gen releases. Ambient occlusion looks a little bit chunky, screen space reflections are quite grainy, and the game now renders at approximately 720p. But the HDRP pipeline is doing good work here, and the One S version looks broadly similar to the current gen release. Performance-wise, the One S targets 60 FPS with mixed results. For the most part, the One S is in 40 to 50 FPS territory. It's not too bothersome because of the relatively placid animation and slow gameplay, and it's reasonable considering the hardware limitations of the system, though a 30 FPS cap wouldn't be a bad option here. So what's the final word on the console releases? Unfortunately, the headline feature that caught our attention in the first place, a ray tracing option on PS5, doesn't deliver the expected results at the moment. Presuming the upcoming patch fixes the issues on PS5, the RT mode should be a worthwhile option. Lightbrick Studios also did inform us that they are planning to release this RT mode on Xbox Series later this year, once Unity implements ray tracing support for Xbox consoles. But perhaps more intriguing would be a more ambitious RT mode that sacrifices resolution to deliver even more ray tracing features and quality. To be fair, the maxed out PC release is extremely demanding, but even still there should be headroom to push settings further here. With a high-end laptop with an RTX 3080 laptop GPU, which has similar performance to a desktop RTX 3060 Ti, I was able to hit a pretty solid 30 FPS in Builder's Journey with all settings maxed out, with RT fully enabled, at a 1080p internal resolution, upscaled to 4K through FSR. Now this is a somewhat more powerful system than the PS5, but it's certainly in the same ballpark, and the use of FSR manages to keep image quality within acceptable bounds despite the relatively low rendering resolution. So perhaps the PS5 could deliver something similar here. That said, the non-ray traced iterations of the game, the 60 FPS mode on PS5, as well as Series X and Series S, work as expected and look great. Regardless of ray tracing support, LEGO Builder's Journey is still a beautiful title that is well worth checking out. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. To view a high quality version of this video, check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch, just use Twitter. That's all for me for now. Thanks for watching.